Hello, we're here today to talk about Purgatorio 11, contributing to this initiative of the Dante Society. So I'm going to be talking to Kristin Nelson, who has an MFA in creative writing. She writes novels. She's a fiction writer. And she became enamored with Dante because she took courses with Alison Cornish at the University of Michigan.
Right. Yeah, and Alison introduced the two of us. I'm sure most of you know Brenda already, but for those of you who do not, she is a emeritus professor of comparative literature and a medievalist of some standing and distinguishment. So today we're going to be talking about the moment, sort of the just inside the gates of purgatory proper. So Dante has traveled through, the sort of the many people loitering outside the gates. He's finally gotten in. So we're thinking sort of it's a parallel canto in many ways to the moment when Dante is first inside the city of Dis in Inferno, and the moment where he sort of like just left the borders of the moon in Paradiso. So here, Dante's just come from admiring the glorious statuary, God's statuary, the examples of humility, which is the first thing that he sees when he arrives in Purgatory proper, gets through the gates. He's about to see the pavement tombs that are the examples of pride. But before that, he's going to see the things in the middle, which are the people. He's just encountered a crowd of souls creeping toward him, carrying these massive rocks on their backs, who are sort of purifying themselves of the sin of pride, the sort of foundational sin. So I think I was going to start off and just chat a little bit about the people who he meets there, and Brenda will get a bit more into the things, the language he uses, the things he says, and particularly his reinterpreted Lord's Prayer at the beginning. But yeah, so we begin with these souls creeping toward us, saying this sort of expanded or like annotated version of the Lord's Prayer, and Dante and Virgil ask them for help. How are we going to get up next? And so Dante ends up speaking to this sequence of three souls. And as I was rereading this, I got really interested in the way those souls behave differently. And in particular, the question of laughter. I got excited about laughter and humor on this terrace. Because the first person that Dante meets, right, is Aldobrandeschi, this sort of, this figure of noble birth, right? Who sort of introduces himself like, I don't know if you've heard of my extremely famous father, but I'm his son, right? So there's this sense with Aldobrandeschi, I noticed that. So another point that Dante makes about these souls is that sort of weighed down by these huge rocks that they're carrying, right? Like he describes them as looking like caryatids or telemons, just pushed down uncomfortably. That some of them can kind of like turn their heads a little bit and some of them can't, right? And Aldobrandeschi is one of those who can't yet. He's just pushed down by this rock. And so when Dante and Virgil ask for help, he directs them very helpfully, right? He says like, there's a stair you can probably climb over there. But then he says, but now listen to my tale of woe, right? Like, here I am Aldobrandeschi, here's my story. And he sort of, gives this sort of very like shamed portrait of himself, right? And then concludes with this line that really struck me as interesting. He says in the Derling and Martinez translation, it's because of my terrible behavior on earth, I must bear this weight here among the dead until God is satisfied, since I did not do it among the living. I thought that was interesting because that sort of strikes me as different from the way that we've been like asked to think about purgation or punishment, right? Like the idea that you do it here because you didn't do it there feels different from the idea that like something is revealed to you. That sort of like the true nature of the thing that you desired, or the true nature of the way that you were, becomes clear, which I feel like is true of the other punishments in purgatory. That you're about to see the people with their eyes sewn shut for envy, right? Like the idea of the sort of this is revelatory. So maybe we sort of question whether Aldobrandeschi has the right handle on things yet, whether he's quite like, with his head sort of bent down so that he can only see the examples of shame, right? Of pride and its consequences. He's still sort of thinking in this like consequential and punishment oriented way, right? But then the next person that Dante encounters, it feels so different, right? Like he meets Odorizzi de Gubbio, the illuminator. And I love that he's an illuminator. I think this is beautiful, right? And that Dante like very specifically sort of chooses to say, the honor of that art called illumination in Paris. So he can use the French word, right? That means illuminator, one who like sheds light, right? So I was thinking about why, so Dante and Odorizzi have this very like friendly and warm and kind of funny conversation. That like, right, Odorizzi addresses Dante as brother, right? And like, and he recognizes him too. Like the two of them like spot each other and like, oh yeah, I know you, right? Like there's this sort of like this warmth born of recognition and of a feeling of like relationship. And the thing that like, I don't know, a couple of things felt exciting to me about that. One of them is, so Dante says, oh, hey, it's Odorizzi, like the guy who's the most amazing illuminator in Paris, right? And Odorizzi's reply is, brother, the pages touched by Franco of Bologna's brush laugh more, right? Like the handy-dandy Sterling Martinez translation glosses that, and talks about like the idea of laughter as itself a kind of illumination, right? Of like, so they quote Dante in Convivio saying, what is laughter except a flashing of the delight of the soul? That is a light appearing externally as it is internally. And so I was thinking about like the way that laughter, what laughter has to do with pride, that like the way that laughter, because right, laughter has this sort of like quality of surrender, right? Like laughter has this quality of like surrender and revelation. Like you can't help it, right? Like there's sort of this sense of when you're moved to laugh, like it's because you've seen something and your body has responded, right? And that there is something sort of like, and which made me think forward to the beautiful moment where Dante and Virgil meet Statius, right? And where, like Dante's like, and Statius, says like, hang on, why did you laugh, right? Like there's this sort of sense of laughter as a revealer of truth. And then that makes it make like a lot of sense to me that then like Odorizzi is sort of teasing Dante, like there's like, so Odorizzi's whole point is that like I have to surrender my position as the best, like trying to be the best is futile, like Giotto succeeds Cimabue, right? Like there's this sort of like onward progress of supremacy in art. So, I have to admit that's how it is. And like, earthly fame is transient, earthly fame isn't what we're after, right? Which all sounds sort of like dire, but he puts it in these very, very funny terms, right? Like, and he famously sort of teases Dante, right? Like because he also like talks about this process of succession in poetry. Just so one Guido, Cavalcanti, has taken from the other, Guinizelli, the glory of our language, and perhaps he is born who will drive them both from the nest, right? And like, that's so right. So that's a moment that often sort of gets talked about as Dante sort of like walking a fine line, right? Like trying to sort of, like say like, I know I'm good, but I know I can't say I'm good, right? But I feel like there's also something genuinely like very self-deprecating about putting it that way. That like, that he like, the self-knowledge here isn't just this sort of matter of like grim acknowledgement of like, I too shall fall, or like I have done wrong. It's like the recognizing oneself as what one is, seeing it as small, and finding that sort of strangely joyful. So that kind of led me into the last person who we meet on this terrace. Who is Provenzano Salvani, right? Who never speaks, who is obviously carrying a very, very heavy weight, but who Odorizzi points out, and who's made it here at all, right? Who's made it through the gates at all, because he sort of surrendered this, huge pride in order to try to rescue a friend, right? And while it doesn't say this in the poem proper, the specific thing he does, right, is to dress in sackcloth and beg, right, in order to raise the ransom for a captured friend. And that was making me think about King Lear, and it was making me think about Edgar and King Lear in particular, because it's a similar sort of process, right? Like the sense that like Edgar surrenders his status and his identity to become this beggar figure, right? Like what's his line? Like, Edgar, I nothing am, right? And through that, he sort of comes to this truthful sense of what he is, right? And in the process helps Lear to do the same, right? The sort of sense that the naked capering beggar who has nothing is the sort of vessel of truth, right? And is also very funny. And I think that's the other thing that struck me here at the end, like thinking about Provenzano Salvani, who's just sort of like trudging on ahead, right? Listening, like not engaging. You sort of get the sense that maybe he's still not altogether, he doesn't think this is funny yet. But yeah, that there's right, that like the nature of pride on this terrace has something to do with relinquishing one's own efforts and relinquishing one's own sort of best ideas, or ideas of one's sort of ideal stature. In order to sort of be able to move or to follow, which sort of led me forward to the idea of Dante's credo, right? Yeah, like the to go signifying, that there's something about the relinquishment of this. I know, yeah, like to carry this rock, right, isn't just about carrying a weight, it's about moving the weight. And the idea of like giving up the idea of moving the weight yourself and seeing what remains, I think was where that carried me in the end. So gosh, yeah, no, all of that, there are 8 million other places you can go with any single thing in Dante. But yeah, no, I'd be curious. So you were thinking, I think you were looking forward a bit to Francis here, and also looking to the Lord's Prayer, I think.
Yeah, I hope so. That's the plan. But you've given me some other ideas to think about, that's for sure. Well, your theme there is obviously epitomized by the opening prayer, which is a Dantesque version of the Lord's Prayer, not quite a translation, although often identified as the longest volgarizzamento in the poem. It is the longest section that appears to be translating the Bible that Dante attempts, On the other hand, the comedy is full of translations of the Bible. It's, it's everywhere. So he's a close reader of the Bible, but it's the sentiment of the Lord's Prayer, which is humility, that, we are, asking God's help for just about everything. And that's to admit our own humility, and in fact, our own embodiment, which laughter itself is one of the best indications of, because laughter is such a spontaneous response to the fact that we are human weakness, human flesh. That is what laughter comes out of the body, even though the mind might trigger it. So there's a nice little connection there between your teasing out that laughter business. Of course, the whole vanitas vanitati theme runs through this entire canto very profoundly. And of course, there's this, in a retrospective reading, we can't help but think of Farinata, that noble Tuscan who is entombed with a heavy stone, basically, above him, never ever to get out of it. At least these are moving stones forward, so that the stone is an important follow through here. The stone of Inferno 10, the stones here of Purgatorio 11, and then the obvious stone of the life of St. Francis, where he had his vision. And it's interesting that in that translation of the Father, that Dante also quotes from Francis's own poetry. So Francis is quite present in this canto, and of course he is a human example of the epitome of humility, who had promoted humility as an answer to the arrogance of the church and the arrogance of his own times. So for Francis, the transient nature of all human things and all human achievements is really the obvious theme. And for Dante to pick out the most famous artists and writers of his time is indeed to think about his own lack of humility or desire to be more humble, perhaps, and so maybe, the joke about maybe, but he too will be chased from the nest. Ironically, here we are 700 years later talking about him. So I don't know whether he clearly, if he's around looking at us, he knows. I hope he's being humble about this, because people have gone mad about Dante this year. but for sure, these echoes of St. Francis throughout the canto, I think, are essential, because they emphasize the necessity, just as the Lord's Prayer does, for the divinity's help. Without the divinity's help, there is ultimately no going forward. And so to ask the divinity for help is to recognize the necessity of humbling oneself. Francis's message ultimately is the Christian message, which, and by the way, Francis's message that is replicating the biblical message, which the Lord's Prayer epitomizes, is in a sense an answer to all human activities. So all human poetry, ultimately against God's word, must take its place in that scheme of things, in making the divine word, which is the beginning of the canto, even if it's in Dante's words and put into Italian, still it's a triumph of God's work and God's words, but mediated through human activity.
Yeah.
So there's a tension there. obvious.
Right. Yeah. No, that idea of mediation in general. Yeah. The sense of, oh no, right. Yeah. Which also sort of like, yeah, takes me back to that moment about the pages that laugh more. Oh no. Did you go? Oh no. Oh no. Are you back? Oh, I think you might be muted. Human vanity of Zoom.